G'day, Sharpie from Sharp Tooling here. Look, what I'm up to now, my service is the front wheel bearings. So same scenario as I mentioned in my previous couple of videos. Last time these bearings looked at were 45,000 Ks on the front, and I did have to adjust this front left one up in Broome because there was a little bit of play. But what I'm going to do is basically show you how I will do a front wheel bearing clean and repack, and in the same motion using the spindle greaser to shoot some grease through to the spindle bearing in no amount of time. So basically I'll talk you through the process. I start off by having the freewheeling hub in free, removing the freewheeling mechanism, removing the freewheeling hub, remove the circlip off the end of the CV shaft, remove the wheel bearing lock nut, and then I'll show you what happens with the spindle greaser if you just want to use the spindle greaser. So this will be the time frame it takes for you to use the spindle greaser if this is all you choose that you want to do as part of your maintenance routine. Alright, so basically with the Landcruiser front wheel bearing, when you're going in for a bit of a service or whenever it's on the ground, it's a really good habit just to get in the habit of just moving your wheel from on the top like this and feel if there's any play in it, and it's going to give you an indication straight away whether you've got to adjust it. This wheel bearing is good, but I still need to get in to repack the bearings because it's been 45,000 Ks. First step of the process is to ensure your freewheeling hub is not in lock. Make sure it's in the free position, because the mechanism inside, when it's in the lock position, it engages this hub. So if you try to remove this mechanism off the end while it's in lock, you're going to stretch it out and it's going to pop, the springs will pop the mechanism apart. Then you're going to have this freewheeling mechanism in multiple pieces, and it's another piece of the puzzle you have to put back together, and it's a bit of a pain in the ass, unless you know what you're doing. So 10mm socket on the end of the freewheeling hub in the freewheeling position. These are should not be done up very tight. If you do tighten, break them and things like that, it's only due to them being over tightened on the previous install. Alright, so 6 bolts, 10mm socket. I just use a 1/4 inch drive because it's nice and handy to use, easy on the fingers, not too heavy on such small bolts. So you're using kind of like a 1/2 inch drive when you're doing these bolts up, you really can just twist the head straight off them. So it becomes a bit of a problem. Alright, so the first step is pull the freewheeling hub off. So the next part of the equation is to remove your your cone washers from in here. So I've just got the battery powered gun here. The nuts I want to bring out to the end so they're flush with the studs. So I'm just going to do that now. Alright, so all of those nuts are flush with the end of the studs. Now, why I have these flush with the end of the studs is because I'm going to shock the stud to release the cone washer that's behind it. A lot of people hit the hub with a hammer, but hitting the hub with the hammer on the outside deforms the metal, and the cone shape that's inside, once it's been hit with a hammer, deforms. So therefore the cone that's sitting in there, the lock in there, never has full surface contact, and it never really locks 100% properly afterwards. And that starts giving you movement in your hubs. So Toyota recommend this technique for a reason. They never in any of their service manuals recommend hitting the hub. So get out of that habit if you're into it. So good solid brass drift. Now that did pop out very easy because I admittedly did have this apart yesterday and I put it back together for the video. So in that motion there, as you can see, it's popped all the cone washers out, and it's the way to go. Right, so nearly there. That's the 6 nuts off the end. 6 flat washers off the end. And now for the cone removal. Often, when we go to remove these cone washers, they're stuck on the studs, they're stuck inside. My favourite tool for helping to get these cone washers out is simply a pair of side cutters. You can get in there, get behind them, and help the shape of the shape of the side cutters just helps get in behind the cone washers there, and it gives you a little bit of leverage to be able to pull them out. So that's my favourite tool for getting the cone washers out. But these ones are all pretty good. All right, so the last step with removing this freewheeling hub here off the end of the wheel bearing hub is one that can be very easy, one that can be very hard. So as you can see, that's not coming, that's all loose though, and it's not coming off. Inside here, camera lady, you might be able to just zoom in a bit please. Inside here and on the end of that CV shaft is that circlip there. You may or may not be able to see it turning. Oh yeah, you can see it turning. Okay, that's good. The secret to get that one out is you can struggle with screwdrivers, you can struggle with the wrong tool, but this little secret is, and it's not a secret, it's just using the proper tool, is just using a pair of flat circlip pliers. I call them like a duck bill. So you can just get in there and it's the right tool for the job, and they're not expensive. And if you're working on your own Landcruiser, it's just an essential tool that you must have. So just get in there, 1, 2, 3, open, and out it pops. So there's your circlip out. So in 1 second it's out. Using any other tool or any other technique, you're struggling, you're doing damage, and you're just getting mad at yourself and wondering why the job's not done. So then, freewheeling hub comes off. All right, so that's how we get the freewheeling mechanism and the freewheeling hub off the wheel bearing hub, so we can start accessing the lock nut and using the spindle greaser. If this is the only action you want to take on your vehicle as a preventative maintenance, this is essentially the process and how easy it is. All right, so we've got the freewheeling mechanism and the freewheeling hub off the wheel. Now my fine camera lady just said to me, Drew, why is the wheel on? Well, I've missed that little bit of information. We leave the wheel on because, as I've already mentioned, this is how you check your wheel bearing play. And you don't need to take the wheel off to adjust your wheel bearings or use the spindle greaser. So that's how easy it is. It's a little bit of outside maintenance. You're not doing a full disassembly of the component like I showed in a previous video about having to take the whole spindle off. So this is how easy it is to use a spindle greaser and adjust your wheel bearings. So, as I've already mentioned, this wheel bearing is okay, but we're going to assume that it's got play in it. So first thing we want to do is we've got the star tab washer. I'll just go here to show you. We have a star tab washer behind the lock nut, which is bent over onto the flats of the nut. So we need to get in there with a chisel or a screwdriver, straighten them out and remove the lock nut. So we'll just do that now, so I can see that right there. Okay, so I'll just straighten that out. We now use our 54mm socket, which is standard for any of these nuts on your Landcruisers. Undo the lock nut and remove it. Okay. So from here, if you have wheel bearing play, what you do is simply grab a little screwdriver, remove the old star tab washer, and you could then adjust your wheel bearing plate. So I'll just loosen it off to simulate here. Okay, so that's simulating a loose wheel bearing there. You can actually hear the noise. So that's the noise you'll have if you jack your front wheel up off the ground and you go to get any movement in your wheel, you listen and you feel. So it's a knocking feel in your hands. You feel the component knocking, which indicates there's clearance there, and you're listening. So is that obvious on the camera? Okay, yeah, good. So that's indicating a loose wheel bearing. So as per Toyota procedure, you just do them up 59 Newton meters, spin it 10 times each way, loosen it off, do that 3 times. So then on the last time, 59 Newton meters, get it back up tight. I'm not doing this perfect because I'm about to disassemble this for a bearing, but you get up 59 Newton meters and then you would reassemble with your star tab washer, obviously a new one, but for the purpose of the exercise, I'm just going to put this back on. Then at that point, you grab your spindle greaser. Spindle greaser goes straight on. Grab your grease gun. Put it on. Pump it full of your 40 pumps of grease. That shoots grease directly through the middle of the spindle next to the CV shaft, fills your spindle bearing full of grease. So as you know, I'm not needing to do it right now, I'll do it on my final assembly, but 40 pumps of grease, take another minute or a minute and a half on top of a simple bearing adjustment. So that is how you do a wheel bearing adjustment. Sorry, I'll get ahead of myself. You remove then the spindle greaser. Then you would put your lock nut back on, lock it up, bend the star tab washers back over it, and assemble all of your hub assembly. So that is how you do a wheel bearing adjustment on the front of the Landcruiser here and use your spindle greaser. But what I'm actually going to move ahead with now is doing my full disassembly, clean the whole hub, and repack the wheel bearings, put it back together. So I'll show you the full job now, rather than just a adjustment and spindle greasing. All right, I just took you through the how to adjust your wheel bearings and use the spindle greaser without using your wheel. Now I'm going to go through the full disassembly of the front hub, get the wheel bearings on the bench, give them a repack. All right, so we start off by removing the wheel. Job number 1 done. Okay, so what I did just here was I've loose assembled the freewheeling mechanism and the freewheeling hub just on there, so it's a visual for you. But I showed you before how to remove everything properly with the cone washers, etc. So next job is, again, make sure it's in the freewheeling position and disassemble your freewheeling mechanism. Remove it off your freewheeling hub. Next thing is, release the nuts out to the end of the studs. Hit them with the brass drift. Release the cone washers. Remove all of the cone washers. Then you can be there and you'll be trying to remove it. Why isn't it coming off? Because you've got on the inside that circlip, which you must remove that circlip with the duckbill style circlip pliers. Once you've done that, you can remove the freewheeling hub. Okay, out the way. Beautiful, next one. Okay, so again, like I showed you before, you bend over the tab on the star tab washer, remove your lock nut. And you remove your star tab washer. So, I've probably got ahead of myself here, but before I worry about removing the hub, we have to release the brakes pads off the rotor and remove the brake caliper. So I'll just get that in position so we can do that now. Okay, so to remove your front caliper off your steering knuckle, the first thing is to do is release the brake pads away from the rotor so you create clearance so you can slide it off. I've inspected all this, the brakes on the front are good, the brake pads are on about 50%, so I don't need to do any major work here with the brakes. So, the idea is to squeeze the pads back and retract the cylinders in the caliper. So we can do that now, but you'd be just pushing hydraulic fluid back up to the master cylinder. So if you've got any crud that's built up or burnt old fluid in your caliper, you're pushing it back up into the system. Not ideal. So what we really want to do is have yourself an old bottle with a little bit of the correct hose and 10mm spanner. Put the hose over the bleed nipple. So you just like that, it's all hanging in there. And then you just crack the bleed nipple open. Now this will allow the fluid to go into waste rather than back into your system. So then I'm just squeezing, you can see the fluid go back up into the caliper there, up into the bottle on both sides. So that is all of the pistons in the caliper being released back. And you haven't pushed any dirty old fluid back into your braking system further up the track, further up in the system. So then just release this off, raise it up, let all the old fluid drain into the bottle, let your spanner slide down the hose so it's there ready to go for next time. Give it a bit of a curly whirly, and yeah, that's easy done way of releasing your brake pads off the cylinder, nice and clean, no messing around, without contaminating any of the fluid that's back up in the system. Maybe clean. If you don't want to do a brake fluid flush, all you got to do now is a top up, because you're taking a little bit of dirty fluid out. Okay, next part of the system is to remove then the brake caliper. So have yourself a bit of wire ready where you can hang your caliper up nicely out of the way so it's not damaging, hanging on the brake lines, which could cause a little bit of damage. Just get in there and undo your undo the two brake caliper bolts. So. So I've got my wire ready. I'm just going to hang it off to the top of the shocker tower. So it's sitting there with a bit of a hook ready to go. So then when I lift it off, I can simply grab it, stick it through the hole from where the bolt goes, create a hook, tie it off. So that there's your calipers hanging safely out of the way. You're not putting any pressure on your brake hose. So therefore, your caliper is now removed off the rotor mechanism, and we can continue on with this job. So recapping, we've removed our freewheeling mechanism. We've removed the circlip off the end of the shaft. We've removed the freewheeling hub. And we've also removed the bearing lock nut and the star tab lock washer. I'm now going to remove the wheel bearing adjustment nut, the inside one. Okay, so this is the bearing, this is the nut, that adjusts your preload on your wheel bearings on the front, and there it is there. So put that in the pile there. It's as simple as now. You got a washer in here and your bearing assembly. So I'm just going to wiggle and pop it all off. And that is your whole brake assembly with your bearings inside. So I lift that straight up to the bench now and we'll start the cleaning process. Okay, so I've got the whole front hub assembly and the rotor up on the bench. The next part off after the lock, the wheel bearing adjustment nut is the wheel bearing thrust washer. We pull that out, we've got our outer tapered bearing, and in the back we've got the inner tapered bearing with the seal. Now I'll show you a trick that I learned off another fella a while ago, that how to remove these seals without damaging them. So traditionally we'd get a screwdriver or a seal removing tool and we pull them out, but that'd damage the seal, so therefore you've always got to get a new seal. So if you're on the side of the road somewhere and you want to, you got some water in your bearing and it's playing up, and you just give it a quick clean and repack to get yourself back home, you want to use that same seal because you haven't got a spare one on you. This is how you get it done. So you just raise it up off the surface of what you're doing. Again, nice soft brass drift. Inside, knock the bearing out from the inside. There you go, 1, 2, 3. She's popped straight out. You've got the bearing out, and you've got the seal out without doing any damage. So you can reuse this seal if you see fit, because there's really, the main reason we're replacing these seals is if there's major damage, obviously, or if we damage it when we're removing it. So through that there, what actually happens when we're using the brass drift to remove that, we're hitting on the top face of the bearing here. So we're using that as a dolly on the seal. So we're not actually applying any major force, and the load is spread throughout the face of the bearing, so it's really quite an easy pop for the bearing to get removed from the hub. So that's a quick, easy way that you can reuse your seal if you need to. Next job now is basically, I'm just going to go through and start clearing out all the old grease and giving it a clean up. So you'll notice inside this hub here, 45,000 Ks, like there's still really good grease on the inside there. Toyota recommend in their service books that you pack the hub full of grease and have it flush. So all I do in this scenario is put a whole heap of grease in there, get something flat, and you wipe it around like that, and that fulfills the role of doing that. So the other side of it is every time I pull my hubs apart, they're always packed with perfect grease. So to be honest with you, all I'm doing is wasting perfect grease every time I do a wheel bearing repack. And it's full of beautiful, good grease still. So it's literally, to be honest, it's just a bit of a waste of money and resources. So if you were to pack your bearings really, really well and have them, you know, really well coated on each side and put them in, I'm starting to challenge my own thoughts about the purpose of having all this extra grease in the middle of the hub. I understand that it's meant to be there so centrifugal force will push more grease into the bearings if required, but I'm not seeing that happen on my own vehicle. So if anyone would like to comment or, you know, give me a bit of an education on what they're finding in their hubs after they're pulling them apart, and what are they finding with their grease, or whether you do add extra grease to the middle of the hubs or you don't, I'd love to really hear some feedback and start the conversation about it. So yeah, cool, I'll move on with cleaning it up now. Alright, so first step is really just get a rag in there, just start taking out the bulk of the grease. It's a cruddy job, yeah, nice rubber gloves save the day a little bit in this particular job. All right, next part of the job, you know, especially when you're at home, a bit of Kero in an old bucket. You know, it's a nice way of cleaning things up. You know, you can use degreaser. You know, I just find that water-based stuff is, you know, often not as good a clean up as the Kero. So also you can, if you're out in the bush, obviously you're not going to get Kero washing your hubs if you need to do a quick repack because you're starting to get grinding bearings, and, you know, a bit of fresh grease is going to get out. So you'll yeah, you do whatever you can in the scrub to get home, there's no doubt about that. So yeah, I'll just continue cleaning all this up with Kero, and I'll be back to you in a minute with a tidy hub. Alright, so I've given it a wash off with Kero, taken it outside for a hose off with the hose to get the bulk of the Kero off, and now it's all covered in water. So now, what happens when you're using your air compressor to spray water, dry water off, it just blows the water everywhere, and often it just blows it onto other parts of the component. You start chasing yourself. So easy little way of doing it is a rag over the top of your component, because when the water sprays off, it grabs on the rag and then you're not chasing it down. So basically, more easy. Stick a rag down inside so it grabs the water too. that's a cleaned up, dried off hub, good enough for now. Still a little bit of water on there, which I can still tidy off a little bit later. I'll move on to doing the clean up of the wheel bearings now, and on the final assembly I'll make sure everything's 100% nice and clean, and I'll go through a few other techniques with you then. So I'll get ready to do the clean up of the wheel bearings now. Alright, so basically same thing, just bearings in a bit of Kero, bit of a wash around. Still, you know, getting all that grease off, which is all quite well and good. So it's going to need a couple of rinses of the bearings, because obviously there's a lot of cavities between the rollers and the bearing cages, and yeah, it's going to need a good blowout. So again, put the bearings between some rags so you're not blowing the Kero everywhere. Start blowing air through the bearing cases. Okay, that's not bad for a rough clean. And so basically that Kero now is pretty well contaminated, so I'll just put that into my bucket here, which is I use for other rough cleans. Give myself another little bit of small amount of fresh Kero for a second rinse. And then I'll do the same thing and rinse it off in the with the hose, and I'll come back and show you the process then. So I'll just go for the second rinse on the bearings, hose them off, and I'll be back. So we've got the bearings that have been washed in the Kero, been washed out in the with the hose, and I've just given them a bit of a dry off. So now you're probably curious, like, what happens if there's a bit of water left in there, a little bit of moisture? Of course, an absolute valid concern. So a bit of super shit auto brake cleaner, whatever brand it is you choose to use, you know, into your bearings. It's a pretty good solvent. It's good for getting rid of any contaminants. And so that's what I do as a final step here to make sure everything's all cleaned up 100%. So it dries off really fast. And you can see now, these are the bearings that are all cleaned up, overhauled, ready to put back in the vehicle. So not too bad, you know, they're pretty good for doing the kilometres. It's certainly not bad enough to replace, although I do know some mechanics that would say they're ruined because they, you know, will make a buck off selling a new bearing kit, and it's often easier to throw the old bearings in the bin and repack a new set than to go through the process of giving them a clean up. There's more labour in cleaning them up than there is to buy a new set for a mechanic. So that's why a lot of mechanics say, mate, we just put new bearings in. But I'm not doing that today. I'm showing you how to do a repack. All right, so that is the bearings cleaned up. The last step here is to just follow the same process with this hub. And I'm just going to give it a bit of a spray out with the brake cleaner in here as well. Get rid of any moisture from inside. And she's going to be good to reassemble. Okay, so the hub is all being cleaned up, you know, and you see, you can give an inspection of the bearing races. You know, they're not perfect, but again, the exercise, I'm doing a repack. You know, the bearings have got a little bit of wear in there, but I've seen a lot worse, and you know what? I'm putting them back in because I can, and yeah, it's going to be all right. It's going to be fine. All right, and although this is a front hub, we don't have the problem of breaking studs on these hubs like we do on the rear. But the habit and the technique and the process is still the same, checking that these studs are tight. So again, I've got my hub stud tightening tool, put it onto the end here, screw it up tight. Now what I've done is I've marked some white marks on these to see, you hopefully can see the stud turn and tighten up when I apply it. So that's about a 1/16 of a turn that went. Now I always tighten up these hub studs when I'm doing a bearing service. So these are not going as far as they would normally, because if you have never tightened up your hub studs and you've had your wheels on and off, axles in and out a few times, you've done quite a few bearing services, I can guarantee you that you'll probably get a 1/4 of a turn in your studs. And this is the basis of the issue when it comes to the rear hub studs breaking on the 75 series, is they're loose and you've got loose wheel bearings. So the two coupled together create this issue of breaking your hub studs on the rear of your Landcruisers. So there you go, they've got a bit of, got that one. Now this is something I do every time. So that's 45,000 Ks of me ensuring that these are tight. So if you've done a couple 100,000 Ks and never looked at these, you're really starting to get into that questionable area of how is the integrity of your whole hub. Now I've tightened that up so I can see that's past there. So that is why I always check the studs on the rear and on the front of these Landcruisers. The front's no real stress, but on the rear, especially where they're breaking, and that's why I have my hub stud tightening tool. So, all right, I'll move on now with packing the bearings. Okay then, so start off with the rear bearing, because it's going to be easy because you put the new the hub seal straight back in as well. Generally speaking, when she's up on the bench like this, she's up on the studs there, so pack the rotor up. So I'll use a couple of timber blocks like I had earlier. So it sits there then, and basically gives it a little bit of support. It's not rocking around too much. With even those, oh, should be right. All right, so got the bearings here, ready to go. So I'm sure everyone knows how to pack a wheel bearing, but for the purpose of the exercise, I'm showing you how I do it, and it's showing how it's easily done without having a special bearing packing tool. So just an easy, neat way that I find doing it is simply just having a scraper, getting like a walnut or a nugget of grease onto your hand, nice and simple. Now what you want to do is you want to push grease into this cavity in here and have it expel out the top of the cavity up here. And that way you're getting all the gaps in between those rollers in there nicely full of grease. So this is how it's done. There you go, look at that. Okay, so you can see, I'll just wipe that grease out in there. So you can see there that now that cavity inside there next to those bearing rollers are fully packed with grease. So that is the desired effect that we're looking for. And so then repeat it the same on the other side. And that's your bearing packed. It's not science. Again, it's a 100-year-old technique. People have been doing this for hundreds of years, but it's amazing the amount of people that I speak to go, I've got a bearing packing machine from the local auto shop because I don't know how to pack bearings. And it really surprises me when the amount of people out there that don't know this technique. And it's really quite basic and it's really quite easy. So run over it again a second time. Just make sure she's all hunky-dory, lots and lots of grease in there. So she's really pushing out. There you go, she's really starting to push out there now, which is good. Get around the other side, know where you start. So now I'm packing from here around to here. Okay, that's a beautifully packed bearing. So now in the scenario, just flood the outside. Just get a nice little bit of grease on the outside there for you. Now, as I mentioned about the internal of the hub to where to recommend really filling it full of grease. For corrosion resistance, it's a good idea just to, at least you can fill that hub full of grease if you want. No one's going to tell you that you're wrong. I'm in the, damn it, I have to check that one before I move on with that. I'm in the process of, I've seen that the grease that's inside that hub's never really doing much. So I am just challenging that idea. So, but what I do is add a stack of grease to the bearing race here, as you can see, and whatever pushes down to the center of the hub, that's enough for me to be happy that there's excess grease in the middle of the hub. Okay, so therefore I've got my new bearing in there now, plenty of grease around the outside. Now, because you're going to put the seal back in here, you don't want to be having too much grease on the outside on the sealing face here, because it can just overflow, push back past the seal and then escape out onto your brake rotors. So I will now just tidy up my hands and I'll put the rear seal in for you. Okay, I've got the seal. I've got a new seal I'm putting back in. But anyway, so that sits there, you know, no problem at all. Putting a little bit of grease on here because that's the mating face of the back of the steering, what do you call it, the spindle, where this seal is always running on that spindle. So you do want to have that lubricated and not have it dry on the spindle as it's turning. So it's as simple as just putting it here. Now, traditionally, we'd use a hammer or something to knock that seal in. As you knock it, it wants to pop up. It wants to pop up out of place, and you know, you hit one side and it knocks the other, all that kind of thing. So you'd be knocking it around gently. But still, if you were to use a hammer or a soft hammer, you can potentially do damage to this. What I have got is just a simple machined up dolly, which is set up for the rear bearings. It's got clearance for the big lip, and the front bearings is just a nice flat front face here. But what I'll do is I'll just use it for the rear side because that's nice and simple, and smash them. So, okay, so the seal's been installed. It's flush with the face on the hub because this face on the dolly here has knocked the seal in, and it won't go any further than that. So that's created the correct clearance in here. Like, you got a little bit of clearance in there for your bearing, and yeah, she's all hunky dory. So that's how you get the rear seal in and the rear bearing. So why you do the rear first is because when you're going to flip it over right now, it's not going to fall apart. So that's all holding in there now. So when we go to move on, after I inspect this bearing I just dropped on the ground, and put the front bearing in, once you put the front bearing in, you pick up the whole assembly and put it on the vehicle. So yeah, this front bearing is no drama at all. So I'm just going to quickly get in the process of just doing a quick pack on this. But as you can see inside the hub there, just from poking some grease down before, there's plenty of grease in there if we need any kind of overflow or to satisfy the requirements of having some grease in the center of the hub. I personally don't think it's necessary to pack the hub out as full as Toyota recommend, because all I've ever seen each time I pulled my hubs apart is perfect grease sitting there and it's done nothing. So yeah, it's just to a point where I just believe it's just a waste of grease. And honestly, in the last 12 months, I've noticed these cans of grease, they were like 14 bucks before COVID, now they're 21 bucks. So, you know, like if we're doing things like this kind of work, you know, everything's gone up 40% in when it comes to this kind of stuff. And last while, people, the mechanics or the suppliers just turn around and say, oh, it's because the items are hard to get now. Well, if they're hard to get, we need to be a bit smarter about how we're using our products and not being so wasteful too. All right, so that's all being fully packed up. I'm just going to get a bit more grease, run it around in the race there. Beautiful. She's all hunky-dory there. Hunky-dory. And now front bearing, the outside bearing just goes into place. And again, give her a bit of a wipe around in there and she's good. So nothing wrong with having a bit of grease on your studs, because it's going to just help them from seizing up or locking up. If you do go in a bit of a corrosive kind of spot like a beach or anything like that, it's not going to hurt. So all right, I'll just tidy up my hands and get ready to lift it back on the car. All right, so I've got the outside bearing sitting in the hub up there, and I've just come down, I've just given the steering knuckle a bit of a clean up, I've given the spindle a clean up, just put a bit of fresh grease on there, and I'll do the reassembly now. So I like to grab that, so as we said before, the back bearing's being held in by the seal. So it's all well and good. The front bearing is sitting in there. I generally like to just do this, hold it with my fingers, push the whole assembly together. There you go, the back is in, the front is in, sitting up nicely. Next step is a little bit of grease on the thrust washer. Generally you can get it out of there, it's no drama. Grease on there. Thrust washer goes on. First the lock nut goes on. Use a little sexy tool. All right, and so this is where you get to the point of doing your wheel bearing adjustment. You can't do your wheel bearing adjustment though without having the wheel on, because you need to be able to turn it, you need to be able to shake it, you need to be able to check it in the same way that I showed you previously. So you've got the hub assembled now, the thrust washer's on, the first bearing adjustment nut is on. So I'm going to move ahead now to clean the brake rotors, clean the caliper assembly, reassemble the brakes, put the wheel on to do the final finish. Now, although the whole brake caliper assembly is not perfectly clean, there's a little bit of grime and everything at the outside, but I'm using the old brake pads, and I haven't got this machine because the brakes are fine. They're still on 50% and the face of the disc is perfect. So the main areas you want to clean are basically just the brake pads. Give everything a little bit of a clean up in there. Wipe it out with a rag. Blow it off with the air compressor. And also the same here. Your brake rotor, back of the brake rotor. Give it a clean up with a rag, both sides. Blow it off with the air compressor. Alright, so that's ensuring your brake rotor and your brake pads are perfectly clean. So then you can move ahead now and reassemble the brake caliper, which I'll do that right now. So might as well just leave the video running. Basically from here, I'll get the wheel out so it's easy to get on. Brake shoes here, they should still be wide enough to go over the rotor, which they are. And just leaving that sit there. Give the bolts a little clean up. Give them a little blow for the air. And I'll just pause because I'm going to tidy up. There's a little bit of grease in these bolt threads here. So I'm just going to pause. I'm just going to give them a really good clean and come on back, and I'll be back in a second, all right? All right, so just a quick Kero wash and a blast off with brakes cleaner and a blow off with the air compressor. A little bit of Loctite, high strength thread locker. I'll just put a little drop on each one with my brakes because I don't want anything coming undone when I'm out in the scrub. So yeah, that's the way I like to assemble it. So yeah, from here on in, I'll just get the bolts started. I'll finish them off with the battery powered impact gun, and then just check the final torque with my rigid bar. So we'll get that done and see you in a sec. Okay, so they're being impacted on, just checked with the rigid bar, got about another 1/16 of a turn out of those bolts, all locked in with thread locker. Caliper is in place, hub is in place, brakes are all clean, bearings have been repacked, and it's all assembled with the first wheel bearing adjustment nut. Next step is, let's get the wheel on and start adjusting the bearing preload. All right, front wheel's on. We can now check for bearing play. It's all been reassembled. So I tightened this up tight before with a rigid bar. There's no play there at the moment. But what we will do is go through the process of setting the bearing preload. So the the bearing preload adjustment nut on the inside here. As you can see, if we were to back this off there, that noise, we got bearing play there, we've got to get rid of that. So the Toyota procedure is to go tight with the rigid bar, tight, spin it 10 each way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so we're going to loosen it off. That's the first one of just seating the bearings. Loosen it off. I like to give it a little spin, let it spin loose. Tighten it up again, tighten it real tight. Okay, that's real tight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so then this time, that's the second time we're loosening it off now. Okay, so we're loosening off, so those bearings are really starting to seat. Now, I'll loosen that off. I can feel there's a bit of play there. It's fine. What I'm doing this time on the third one, I'm just nipping it up. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm doing the same as the rear, 59 Newton meters, and I'm then going to set it up to get locked up right there. And here's the tool. And yeah, so there's a bit of different ways of people do the front. You know, they use like a fish scale to ensure they've, I think it's 2 to 5 kilos of pressure on your bearing and all that kind of thing. And to be honest with you, it's all a little bit hard, and sometimes it's often quite inconsistent. So the easiest way I find is simply to set the preload, the same as you set the preload on the back. There's no confusion then, and you're getting it consistent front to back. So 59 Newton meters, 59 Newton meters on your torque wrench. Okay, 1, 2, that's 59 Newton meters. There you go, you got a wheel bearing that's just turning perfectly there. So there's no play in it. You've done exactly the Toyota procedure. It's 59 Newton meters, the same as the rear. So now we move on to fitting the star tab lock washer on top of your bearing adjustment nut. And this is where, on your reassembly, at this point, if on reassembly now, before we put the final bearing lock nut in place, we get our spindle greaser. So this is where the added extra time it takes to get grease into your spindle bearing. This is all the extra time it takes, is just this amount of time here. So you can almost put your stopwatch on and check it out. So spindle greaser goes onto the end of the spindle. Grab your grease gun and do 40 pumps. 10, 15, 20, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30, 40 pumps. Okay, so you've just lubricated the spindle bearing, which deep is inside your spindle on that CV shaft. Look at all that grease there. Look at that grease there. It's shot grease deep into your steering knuckle, lubricating that spindle at the same time. So it's happy days. So we just used the spindle greaser and we've pumped grease right through to the center of the spindle bearing, and yeah, she's all happily lubricated here. So what I've just done is just wiped off any excess off the end of the CV shaft, and now we're going to move on with the rest of the assembly, knowing that we've got our wheel bearing adjusted correctly. The spindle bearing has been lubricated nicely, and yeah, so the star tab washer goes on, which we use to bend over our nuts here, and now the wheel bearing lock washer, lock nut, sorry, goes on. So that's just done up tight there. I just torque it up to the same setting as the adjustment nut, 59 Newton meters. Just lock it on. Okay, so that's locked on. Simple now. We just bend over the tabs to make sure everything's all locked in correctly. That's locked on the center one. And inside, this one here looks like it's a nice one to come on the outside. So, let's see, a bit greasy on the fingers. And yeah, she's good and happy on there. So that is all bent over and locked in there. So now, all of the wheel bearing assembly is now locked into place and spinning nice and freely. Next process is to put the freewheeling hub and freewheeling mechanism back on, so I'll just organise that now. Okay, so I've gathered the freewheeling hub, freewheeling locking mechanism, all my cone washers, flat washers and everything, gaskets, circlip to put all back together and start reassembling. So you just want your faces where the gaskets are to be fairly clean. Again, we've seen people in the past use silicone on these gasket faces. It's absolutely not required. They don't come from the factory with any kind of sealant other than this paper gasket, and that's all that is needed. It's just a seal, more or less, to just stop any dust and water and everything going in there. And silicone only creates a hell of a mess when you want to do a reassembly or a disassembly next time. It just makes a hell of a mess. So if you want your hubs easy to pull apart and keep them cleanish like we're looking at here, this is the only way to do it. So, all right. Now I'll just get the outside hub there on. Follow that up with the cone washers. 3, 6, one more goes on there. After the cone washers go the flat washers. After the flat washers go your locking nuts. So we'll just get these on, and I'll just get these all sorted out with my greasy fingers, and yeah, once they're all in place, I'll get ready to torque them up. And okay, so I've got all the freewheeling hub, cone washers, flat washers, and nuts in place. For the HDJ or the 78 series or anything with the 10mm studs, the torque setting is 33 Newton meters on these bad boys. So I'm just going to do them up to 33 Newton meters right now, and yeah, we will be happy days when that's all done. So, and just about got it there. So we'll go for our final torque on it now, 33. Six, I'll just run around, make sure they are all correct. Okay, so the freewheeling hub now is fixed to the wheel hub with the cone washers, flat washers, and nuts at 33 Newton meters. And again, I'll stipulate that's for the 10mm studs. If you're running 8mm studs, the torque setting is less. I don't have that on me right now because I haven't looked it up for a while. But you'll have to double check exactly what that torque setting is if you're using 8mm studs. Now the next step is to get this circlip on. Now it's quite easy to get this tool and wonder, sorry, it's jumping in front of the camera, wonder why the circlip is not going on. Okay, so if you just get this circlip, it doesn't fit on the end of the shaft there because of the CV shaft has been pushed in once, you know, when we've been taking all this hub assembly off. So you get an 8mm bolt, put it in the middle of the CV shaft. Okay, that screws straight in there. And just get something simple like a screwdriver and pull it out. So that just pulls out there probably about 5 or 6mm. That allows the shaft to come out and exposes the circlip groove that's inside of there. So now the circlip being held on the tool, bang, straight on there. And now the way that you can tell that the circlip is in place is that you can spin the circlip around, okay? If you can't spin the circlip around, it's not sitting in there correctly. So that's sitting in there nice and freely there. So that's how you tell that's done. Okay, so that's had a perfect install. Next step is to get the freewheeling hub. Again, all the mating faces have been cleaned. That grease in there is not brand new, but it's only to lubricate the freewheeling hub, so I'm not going to get too fancy about that today. But there's one major trick to installing this freewheeling hub that could leave you scratching your head if you've never done it before, and also it could lead you to damaging and having this whole assembly pop apart if you go to install it incorrectly. So I'll show you. So first off, just get your new gasket on there nice and neatly. It's easy to put it on now rather than hold it up against that face and try and do an install. That all locates in there exactly where it's meant to be. So on the freewheeling hub, there is parts of this mechanism here that locate into the grooves on the hub. So it's like this. I'll show you, just clean it up so you can see exactly what's going on in there. Okay, so you can see the grooves. You can see that groove. And you see that groove has got a part of a tab that's bent over here. Now, it's not on each group of grooves. That doesn't have the bent over tab. That doesn't have the bent over tab. But opposite here is another one that's been bent over. So that tab holds this mechanism into place here and dictates the way that this locates onto the hub. Now, camera lady, if you come in here, you'll see that we have a double groove here and a double groove here and a wide groove and a wide groove. This here with that tab goes in the wide groove. So if you try and put it in any other way, it's going to get stuck, and when you pull it out, all of this is going to pop off and come apart. So you want to get that tab in the wide groove. The easy way I do it is simply line it up top to bottom on the wide groove, get your tab on the vertical 12 o'clock position, simply slide it in. And it's that's it, that's popped straight in there. That's how we do it. So then we just go ahead and grab your 10mm 1/4 inch drive socket and start screwing in the small bolts that we got here. Now, the last thing I'll really emphasize with these bolts is that they are really quite small. They're a 6mm thread. So we get quite easily, you know, in a rush sometimes we want to grab the closest tool to us, and it might be a 3/8 drive, it might be a 1/2 inch drive socket. But these little bolts shear the heads off them so easy, it's not funny. And they don't need a lot of torque to hold them on. It's been a long time since I looked up the torque on these, but it's like next to nothing. And from memory, it's something like 5 Newton meters in the book. It's absolutely nothing Toyota recommends. So you just get your little 1/4 inch drive, your most lightest, gentle socket that you can find. And just with the finger pressure, okay, so make your way around. Okay, so they're all firm now, but then just last time, just with your wrist hand over the 1/4 inch, just basically we're just going to just give it a little pump. All right, just so they just don't turn any further. But what happens when you're using a bigger drive than the 1/4 and you go around for a 3rd time, see, that's already firm. So the 3rd time, they're already firm. You might get a tiny little bit more out of them. But what happens with a 3/8 drive or a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch drive socket, you don't have the feeling that you've got here in this hand right now with this small, and you can really over torque them and you can snap the heads off these bolts, and then you've just, yeah, you've got more work to do then. So, what we've got there is the freewheeling hub back on, we've got the circlip back on the CV shaft, we've got the freewheeling assembly back on, it's assembled in the free position, everything's in there beautiful, everything works correctly, that locks in, I just heard it click when I put it over to lock, so now I can put it back to the free position, So yeah, I think the job's toasted. So we've done a full front wheel bearing hub strip, wheel bearing clean repack. We've used a spindle greaser to lubricate the spindle bearing. We've reassembled all the freewheeling hub mechanism, and yeah, all the brakes are all back on, nice tightened up with the brake calipers and all that kind of thing. So that is the job done on how to do a front Landcruiser wheel bearing repack and using the spindle greaser tool to lubricate the spindle bearing. So I really hope you've enjoyed this. So yeah, leave us some comments and tell us how you found it. Thanks very much. See you later.